All right, it's my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker of the summer, Dr. Stacey Pulver. She received her BS in marine biology from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington in 1999, and her DVM from North Carolina State University's College of Veterinary Medicine in 2005. She is currently a biologist on the aquaculture drugs team at the Food and Drug Administration's Center for Veterinary Medicine. And as part of this new animal drug application process, she reviews target animal safety and effectiveness studies that are submitted to support the approval of aquaculture drugs. And during the last 16 years, Dr. Pulver has reviewed drug submissions for fish and shellfish, which included the review of protocols, scientific data to support drug development, user safety, labeling, adverse drug events, and bioresearch monitoring assessments. Prior to joining the FDA in 2007, she spent 2 years as a veterinary intern at the National Aquarium in Baltimore. And many of you might recognize Dr. Pulver from the Eastern Fish Health Workshop, where she helped organize that event from 2014 to 2020. And she currently resides in the Chicago suburbs with her husband, 2 children, and 2 crazy beagles. Take it away, Stacey.
Thank you. Thanks to Nick, Megan, and Matt for inviting me to speak to you today. I know drugs and drug use and development of drugs is a rather complicated subject. So I have a presentation plan that's pretty high level, but if you have questions, I will try to do my best to answer them. I'll go a little bit more about me. I think Nick, hang on, there. So just a little bit about me, my pathway to FDA. I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. I, as a child, would create these beautiful collages of all these colorful fish, thinking I would just scuba dive with them the rest of my life. So naturally, I decided I'd go be a marine biologist. I went to UNCW, but while I was there, I had no idea really what I was going to do with a marine biology degree. I would go home for the summers, and I volunteered at the Shed Aquarium. And while I was there, saw one of their veterinarians tube feeding a wolf eel, and realized that aquariums had veterinarians. And so I went back to school, started taking prerequisites for vet school. Ultimately, got into NC State, had 4 wonderful years there with great mentors and great friends. Like Nick said, went on to do a 2-year veterinary internship at the aquarium in Baltimore, but I think the dolphins killed me. So I did a little bit of an about face, and at the time I was finishing my internship, there was a job opening at FDA and on the aquaculture drugs team, and I thought it was a great opportunity for me to continue to use my knowledge in fish health. Sort of in a different way. So now I've been at FDA for almost 16 years. I've been on the same team doing a lot of the same thing. I've done some, details where we get to go out and try different things. I've had a really great time at FDA. And so I tell you all that because I think for the students out there, it's important to know that it's okay if you don't know where you're going. It's important to know that if your path changes, it's okay. And also it's important to know that there's good jobs in the government. I'm really lucky that I'm here, and I really enjoy what I do. FDA is within the Department of Health and Human Services, which is part of the executive branch of the government. You guys probably are familiar with FDA. Recently with the COVID pandemic, FDA is responsible for, vaccine approval for humans. And so today, though, we're going to focus on aquaculture. And since you guys are all aquaculture or fisheries folks, focus on drug development and drug use for fish. So we'll go through what does FDA regulate, how do drugs get approved, What drugs are approved, conditionally approved, or indexed for fish? Why aren't there more drugs approved for fish? What about the rest of the alphabet soup of government acronyms? We'll go through a few of those, and then how can more drugs get approved? How perhaps can we help, and how can you help? So first, what does FDA regulate? Well, jurisdiction of animal products in the US is different from jurisdiction of human products. Animal drugs are regulated by CBM under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, and algicides are regulated by EPA under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. And biologics or vaccines are regulated by USDA under the Virus, Serum, and Toxin Act. And also animal drugs, animal devices, and animal foods are all under FDA. You know, sometimes there's a question as to what category a product falls into. And in that case, there's joint agency committees that evaluate the product and determine the appropriate oversight. So we all work together to see whose authority there is over certain products. FDA's regulatory authority comes from our law, our Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and all of its amendments. So if you've heard of the Minor Use and Minor Species Act, that would be an amendment to the FFDCA. Also, we follow the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So NEPA requires U.S. federal agencies to consider the potential environmental impacts of their actions. And so major agency actions require the submission of an environmental assessment or the claim of categorical exclusion. And so these major actions would be any action under an INAD. So I know we haven't gotten into what an INAD is yet, but that's, you know, the development of a drug, or an approval of a drug, or supplemental approval of a new animal drug. So that requires us to follow NEPA. We also have our regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations under 21 CFR 511 to 514. And we also have lots of policies and guidelines out there, what we call guidance for industry documents. Those typically explain our current thinking on a particular topic. And so we publish the guidance documents to help sponsors work with us or get through certain parts of the drug application process. So what is a new animal drug? New animal drugs are required by law to be approved, conditionally approved, or indexed by the FDA before they can be legally marketed for use in the US. The Act defines a drug as articles intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, and articles other than food intended to affect the structure or function of the body of man or animals. As an example, if you look at formalin, so I'm sure many of you have used formalin as a parasiticide. So it's a drug when it's intended for use as a parasiticide, but it is not a drug when it's intended for use as a tissue preservative. There are 3 pathways for an animal drug to be legally marketed. The first is the traditional approval pathway, where a sponsor has demonstrated safety and effectiveness of their product. The other pathway is called conditional approval, and that came out of the Minor Use, Minor Species Act of 2004. This is an option for sponsors where they can demonstrate all of safety to the full standard. And then for effectiveness, they've provided a reasonable expectation of effectiveness. The sponsor can, once they've provided safety and the reasonable expectation of effectiveness, they can apply for conditional approval. And if we agree, we grant the conditional approval, and then they would have 5 years to provide the effectiveness data to the full standard, in which case that within that 5 years, the drug would hopefully become fully approved. And then the third pathway is indexing. So indexing is a process whereby new animal drugs intended for use in minor species, so fish are minor species, they've had their safety and effectiveness affirmed through an alternative FDA review process. So indexing provides a faster and less expensive process to obtain legal marketing status for eligible products. And this also came out of the MUMS Act, and it's intended to be helpful for animals or classes of animals that represent markets that are really too small to support the cost of the drug approval process. There's a few more slides later on indexing, and we'll definitely cover what products are on the index. All right, so how do drugs get approved? Well, before I get into this, there's a great article on our FDA website called From an Idea to a Marketplace, the journey of an animal drug through the approval process. I encourage you to read it. It's plain language and really does a great job of succinctly explaining the approval process. But typically sponsors, not FDA or CBM, propose a drug product or label indication to us. They go through a discovery phase or a proof of concept, or they've identified a compound that they think would work. And they might do some preliminary research to determine if they want to take it through to a full approval. And so they reach out to us early in development, but typically after they've done some preliminary work. And so when they initially reach out to us, they will request to open an INAD file, or an investigational new animal drug file. This file, within this file, this is sort of the repository file that holds all the data and information that a sponsor will provide, and then that information will be used to ultimately to support the approval of the product. And so this file will contain communications with us, including one of the main ones is the pre-submission conference, where we'll work with sponsors to agree on a development plan. They might ask us questions about study design or how many studies are needed. And then they'll go on, they'll submit some protocols to us, hopefully for review, and we'll advise on study design. And then they'll go conduct the studies. And then they will submit the data and the reports from those studies to us for review. The file also contains some other things like literature and other information. And so that's sort of how in the early stages and the sponsor will work with us. So there's I call this slide 4 critical approval standards: safety, effectiveness, quality manufacturing, and proper labeling. We also have another term called technical sections. There's 5 main technical sections and 2 minor technical sections. And so you'll see that on the next slide, but when we talk about safety includes human food safety, which their requirements to address toxicology, residue, microbial food safety, and also an analytical regulatory method that provides a method to allow for testing of the drug in tissue. There's target animal safety, which is the sponsors responsible for proving that the drug is safe for the target animal. Human user safety, where anyone that may come in contact with the product from manufacturing to use of the product will evaluate and, if needed, include appropriate labeling statements. And then environmental impact. We talked a little bit about NEPA already. So sponsors will need to address the environmental impact of a drug approval. And then effectiveness. So effectiveness and target animal safety are the primary technical section or parts of the application that my team that reviews. And so effectiveness, we ensure that the drug does what the sponsor says it does. Does it actually treat columnaris disease? Does it actually sedate the fish? And we work with sponsors to identify appropriate endpoints and study designs to ensure that the drug is effective. There's also a whole chemistry, manufacturing, and controls technical section that evaluates the manufacturing of the product. And then also before it gets approved, we'll review and ensure proper labeling. So once all the technical section data and information from all 5 of the major technical sections, and then also the labeling and what we call all other information. Once all of that is assembled and submitted to us, and we've determined that it's complete, the sponsor will then submit the new animal drug application. And at that time, we have been developing, and we'll finish a document called the Freedom of Information Summary. And at the time of the approval, we will make that Freedom of Information Summary publicly available. And that describes the safety and effectiveness data that we use to determine the drug is safe. There's also, from the environmental impact review, there'll be a publicly available environmental assessment, or the finding of no significant impact. If either of those are applicable, those will also become publicly available. And our website, Animal Drugs at FDA, provides links to all the FOI summaries for all drugs that are approved. And especially for aquaculture, I'll just do a shout out to FOIs. I know many people are probably not familiar with FOIs, but they can be very helpful to see how studies were designed, what the water conditions were in the studies, what fish species were used in those studies. And so they can perhaps help end users understand the conditions under which the drugs were tested. So certainly if you've not seen an FOI, I recommend reviewing some. So what does it mean when a drug has received an NADA approval by FDA? Well, it means that the product is safe and effective for its intended use, and that the methods, facilities, and controls used for manufacturing, for processing, for packaging, those are all adequate so that the drug, to preserve its identity, the strength of it, the quality, and the purity. And so an approval is for a very specific product formulation. When we say formalin's approved, there's 3 formalin products approved. But if you were to try to purchase formalin from, a chemical manufacturer and use it, that would not be an approved product. FDA, like I said, FDA approvals for a very specific product formulation. And that's because the manufacturing processes and quality of the product, that's really integral in drug safety and effectiveness. So the manufacturing of the products very important to ensuring the drug is safe and effective. And so, in summary, when a drug's approved by FDA, we're saying that we've systematically evaluated the safety and effectiveness. And this ultimately protects human and animal health. We also, after a drug is approved, there's also some post-approval monitoring through inspections, label reviews. Companies routinely want labels updated. They're also developing promotional material, so we'll review all of that. We also receive adverse drug events. Sponsors are required to submit ADEs or adverse drug events regularly. And so we'll review any that come into us. If you have ever experienced an adverse drug event, we encourage you to submit that to us or directly to the drug company. So what drugs are approved, conditionally approved, or indexed for fish? Currently, there's no drugs that are conditionally approved for fish, so you won't see everything that I'm going to talk about is fully approved. And at the end, we'll also talk about index product. Because drugs that the drug approvals, what is approved changes. If you're looking at this presentation years from now, the best place to find updates to this would be to go to Animal Drugs at FDA or to read the label of the drug that you're using. Approved FDA drugs include an NADA or a NADA and a 6-digit number associated with it. So that would be one way to double check that it's actually an FDA approved drug. We're going to go quickly through some of these because you can very easily find this information elsewhere. So first, the medicated feeds, or what we call medicated articles intended for use in the manufacture of type B and type C medicated feeds. It's a handful, huh? There's 4 medicated feeds that are approved. Sulfamerazine is not currently marketed and hasn't been for a long time. So Aquaflor, it's available for catfish, freshwater reared salmonids, freshwater reared warm water finfish, and then all of freshwater reared finfish for columnaris disease. There's also terramycin 200 for fish and terramycin 100 for fish. This actually just recently had an expansion of the approved indications for columnaris to all freshwater reared salmonids and catfish. And then also Romet 30. Next up, I believe we have the immersion products. There's Halamid Aqua, formalin, hydrogen peroxide, and oxytetracycline. There's a variety of products for oxytet, and again, not all of those may be marketed. For immersion, there's also Syncane. Most of the industry also knows as Triacane or MS222. This is for temporary immobilization of fish, amphibians, and other aquatic cold-blooded animals. We have 1 injectable drug approved. That's Chlorulon, which is a spawning aid. Okay, so that's it for approved drugs. And we'll get into why there's not a lot of other drugs approved in a moment. But first, let's just touch on indexing. So this is an alternative to the approval process. It provides a legal marketing status, but it's not considered an approved drug. There's a 3-step process to getting a drug added to the index. There's first a submission for us to submission to our Office of Minor Use and Minor Species. They're the office within CVM that handles all indexing drugs. So this is not index products don't come through my team. But there's a submission to that office asking if this drug is eligible to be added. If it is, then the next step would be the sponsor to organize an expert panel and create a report and submit that to us. And then if we agree, then there'll be an addition to the index. And of course, that's highly simplified. For details about indexing, there's a guidance for industry 201 that'll describe how a sponsor goes about adding a drug to the index. But I should point out that index products are only for non-food animals or non-food life stages of food producing minor species. And there's no extra label use of index products. And the three products that are indexed for ornamental fish include Overprim, which is a spawning aid, and then 2 sedatives, two for sedation and anesthesia, the Aquacalm and the Alfaxan multidose. So those, if you work in ornamental fish culture, those would be available to you to use. All right, next, what's up next? So why aren't there more drugs approved for fish? Challenges. So drug research and development is expensive. Drug approvals are also specific for a particular species or group of fish, for a particular disease or condition, and really for good reason. If they were broad and encompass multiple diseases, multiple species, there'd be a lot of assumptions being made if it wasn't supported by data. And that really defeats the original purpose of why the legislation was enacted, to protect the public and to make sure the drugs actually do what they're intended to do and are safe. We do incorporate, a risk-based approach to drug development where we can. One example of that's through grouping of fish species. I just went through the approved products, and some of them are approved for things like olive salmonids or warm water fish or cool water fish. And so in the development of those approved drugs, we determined that we had enough scientific data to approve the drug for that grouping, and that was based on effectiveness and safety. But this approach may not work for all drugs. Aquaculture is also a very small market, and that'll, I think you guys know that. I don't think that's new information, but I'll highlight that in the upcoming slides. And because it's a small market, there's really a low economic return for pharmaceutical firms. They have low motivation to seek approvals if only the US market is being considered. FDA approval, of a new drug in humans is worth billions of revenue. But similarly, FDA approval FDA approval of a new drug in a major terrestrial species like a cow or a dog, that can also be worth millions of dollars. But conversely, in aquaculture, a company may never, recover the cost of their investment. And so the economic incentives, don't exist to really entice pharmaceutical companies to always pursue aquatic species. A lot of the way it works now is a lot of the pharmaceutical companies rely on our public sector agencies or entities to help out with drug development. And I'll go through that in some slides coming up. So just as a comparison, the US aquaculture industry in 2018 was worth about 1.5 billion, where the total food size catfish sales were 341 million and trout production was 106 million. But in comparison to the livestock industries, the cattle industry in 2017 was worth 77 billion, poultry 49 billion, hogs and pigs 26 billion. And so you can see that the livestock industry is much bigger than aquaculture, and so companies tend to put more work behind drugs for those industries. Honey production seemed comparable to the catfish, the food size catfish. So in an ideal world, there would be safe and effective new animal drugs approved or legally available for all animals and all possible needs. And there'd be data to provide withdrawal periods for all the food producing species. even for extra label use, there'd be consistent enforcement, and all of this would also serve public health and animal welfare. But in the real world, there's unapproved drugs. Aquaculture is very diverse. There's many needs, many species, and drug companies can't address all the diseases or conditions. And part of that is because the economic return is just too low to address all of them. And then also enforcement resources are limited. Stakeholders though still need access to drugs. There's a wide variety of stakeholders: veterinarians, owners, farmers, government entities, the commercial industry. Aquaculture is diverse. I keep saying that over and over. And of course, there's also the fish that are involved in research. Researchers often need IACUC approval for their studies, including the use of animal drugs, and it could be a problem if the drugs are not approved for the needed use in the research study. Okay, so I just kind of finished explaining all the challenges with aquaculture drug approval. Before I get into some solutions and future activities, I'm gonna quickly touch on the alphabet soup. So INADs, I mentioned that as part of the using the files to develop drugs. So while a drug is being investigated, or really before it reaches full approval, sponsors submit data to support the approval to their INAD file. And opening this file allows sponsors to ship those drugs that they need to get to the research locations, allows them to ship in interstate commerce. It allows sponsors to send treated animals to the food supply following compliance with an investigational withdrawal period. We also call this a food use authorization. There's an environmental review of this investigational drug use, and typically there's a protocol that is developed under the INAD file. All right, next up, VFDs. So VFDs could really be a separate hour-long presentation. And I only have this single slide. I apologize if you guys were hoping for some more VFD information. But I've provided hopefully some resources for you if this topic is confusing. So a VFD drug, the veterinary feed directive drug, is an animal drug intended for use in or on animal feed that requires the supervision of a licensed veterinarian. A VFD is a written statement issued by a licensed veterinarian in the course of the veterinarian's professional practice that orders the use of the VFD drug or combination drug in or on animal feed. And there's this whole topic I could spend probably another hour talking about. There's a couple really good guidance for industry documents, 120 and 233, plus some others. And I think FDA is a pretty good VFD website that addresses questions and answers. So I can try to answer questions at the end, but also feel free to email us if you have any after this presentation. All right. Extra label use. So EXLU, you might see that acronym. You might hear off-label use or extra label use. So that is the actual use or intended use of a drug in an animal that is not in accordance with the approved labeling. So if the drug is approved in catfish and you want to use it in a salmonid species, that would be extra label use. If the drug is approved for columnaris disease, but you want to use it for ESC, that would be extra label use. Or if you need to up or decrease the dose according to the species you're using it on, that would be extra label use. So different species, different indication, different dosage, all those mean that you're not using it in accordance with the labeling. And so the ability to do this is in our Code of Federal Regulations. And so under the provisions of those regulations, we say 21 CFR 530, the extra label use of drugs by veterinarians is allowed under certain conditions. So such use is limited to treatment modalities when the health of an animal is threatened or suffering or death may result from failure to treat. So it's not going to be allowed for production uses. It has to be when the health of the animal is threatened or suffering. It requires a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. Extra label use is not allowed in or on animal feed, and I'll come back to this in a moment. The veterinarian should establish a substantially extended withdrawal period, and then there's lots of other conditions actually described in 21 CFR 530. So if you're using drugs extra label, please refer to those regulations. So going back to the extra label use in or on animal feed. So according to our law, the extra label use of medicated feeds is not allowed. However, there's minor species. We recognize that minor species like fish cannot be practically medicated in any other way. And also there's very few drugs approved for treatment of fish. So it was probably five years ago, 6 years ago, we decided that we needed to update this what we call CPG, or compliance policy guide. And so we decided we needed to exercise enforcement discretion regarding the use of extra label use of medicated feeds. And so the CPG is intended to provide guidance concerning our enforcement discretion, and provide the provisions under which a veterinarian could allow the extra label use of a medicated feed. And so that guidance, the CPG, describes, the requirements or what needs to be documented and how the drugs can be used for the veterinarian, the farmer, the medicated feed manufacturer, distributor. And if those involved follow the guidance, then FDA is unlikely to take action against this use. So it really allows for aquaculture to use those medicated feeds like Aquaflor and Terramycin 100 and 200 and Romet off in an extra label manner. Also, low regulatory, next up is low LRP list. I don't know how many of you have heard of the LRP list. CVM has a policy and procedures manual, 2040.4200, and the title of it is Enforcement Priorities for Drug Use in Aquaculture. FDA reviewed and identified compounds where the agency determined were unlikely to object to the use of them if certain conditions are met. So towards the end of that PMP, there's a list of, I don't know how many, but many compounds where if someone was using those as laid out in that guidance, we wouldn't take any enforcement action against them. One example is acetic acid. If you used it between 1,000 and 2,000 ppm as a dip for 1 to 10 minutes as a parasiticide for fish, even though that would likely constitute fall under the drug definition, we would not take action. All right, so getting back to how can we get more drugs approved? Well, what is CVM doing? What are we doing? Back in, a year and a half or so ago, we developed a strategic plan. So for the fiscal year 2022, 2026, our vision is to have an efficient, innovative, transparent, responsive system that ensures access to safe and effective products for all sectors of aquaculture and advances productivity and animal health and food safety. The goals are to increase the number of safe and effective products for aquaculture, encourage responsible use of aquaculture products, and enhance internal and external collaboration. And then as part of that strategic plan, several internal working groups have been developed addressing issues and roadblocks that we've identified and where we can help help the industry help get more drugs approved. One of which was what we've called CARP, or the Comprehensive Aquaculture Research Plan. And we're hoping with that just to identify some research opportunities that will support aquaculture drug development. At CVM, we also have a project manager that is devoted to aquaculture. Navigating the drug approval process can be confusing. And so she is a reliable source to help sponsors get through the application process. Like I said, we take a risk-based approach to meeting drug approval requirements. Within FDA, we also have a liaison to the USDA program called the Minor Use Animal Drug Program. And that's a USDA program designed to address the shortage of minor use animal drugs by funding and overseeing the efficacy and animal safety required for FDA approval. So the scope of the program is really for minor animal species of agricultural importance. And so we have a liaison in our Office of Minor Use and Minor Species that works with that program. We also have, as part of the MUMS Act, there's also designation and there's grant money available for products that have been designated, especially if the sponsor has developed a protocol and received concurrence on it from us. They can ask for grant money to fund a study that would be conducted with that protocol. So it would reduce the cost of some parts of the drug development requirements. You know, we try to get out to attend industry meetings and see what scientific advancements are being made, and also interact with our partners and listen. We conduct outreach. We also seek public input in a lot of ways. We two areas where recently we saw public input. One was we saw public input on whether we should expand the eligibility for indexing for certain groups of animals. And then the other one was for draft GFI 61. And both of those went out for public input. We received many comments on both of them and have made revisions based on them. And we think positive revisions to respond to these requests for input. And we also can exercise enforcement discretion, but it's typically limited and case by case. So in order for drugs to get approved in the US, there are partnerships. There's our public data generating partners. One of the big ones is the US Fish and Wildlife Service ADAP program, or the Aquatic Animal Drug Approval Partnership Program. They conduct a lot of target animal safety and effectiveness work, and they work with us. They also have many INDs available for folks to use drugs. We've also, I mentioned the USDA Minor Use Animal Drug Program. And then also we've worked with other partners such as USGS, the UMass group up in Wisconsin. There's interagency collaboration and support with NOAA, with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and the Regional Aquaculture Center. One other example of this is the Marine Aquaculture Medicine Cooperative, or MAMC. So that's a collaborative effort, and one of their goals is to help identify the need for drugs in marine aquaculture. So we'll hopefully continue to work in that area, because we all know marine aquaculture is developing in our country. Commercial industry, we also work with commercial industry and state and federal hatcheries. There's an aquatic drug approval coalition that has representatives from all these partnerships, and they regularly meet with us to help move drug approval efforts forward. There's other support, such as from the National Aquaculture Association. There's support from manufacturing sponsors, and then us, and we're all working to move to get more drugs approved. So what can you do? So we certainly always encourage the use of approved or index products, conditionally approved or index products. You can support drug research through participation in INAD studies, in working with those partners that were on the prior slide, and you can provide technical expertise. Attend meetings where drug development is discussed. If there's an unmet need, if you are finding a disease or condition that you don't have a drug for, communicate that to the drug companies or to those partners. Maybe they can help identify something that could be used, something that could be developed. If you're using a drug under an INAD, follow the protocol and collect and submit data on safety and effectiveness. Provide comments for requests for public input. Like I said, we responded to a couple recent ones that affect aquaculture. So if you don't understand a topic, or you have a specific question or a nuance associated with the drug use, please ask us. I think our team is very nice. We really are, we want to help. And so we encourage you to submit questions directly to us through preferably through askcbm@fda.hhs.gov. Make sure you understand the regulations, the extra label use regulations, the current good manufacturing practice regulations for proper mixing of medicated feeds. Please report adverse drug events, including the lack of effectiveness. And then help develop drugs for approval and for the index, and serve as an expert on the expert indexing panel. So here are some resources. There's our main CBM website. There's an aquaculture website. There's links to all the guidance for industry. There's a BFD page. The CPG that I mentioned that lays out the extra label use of medicated feeds. There's also links to the animal drugs at FDA, where within each approved drug, you can see the FOI summaries and all other guidance for industries that are on there. And I already mentioned the idea to a marketplace, talks about the approval process. Drug development, there's a new website that we've done just recently published. It's drug development resources for animal drug sponsors, and so I think that's really helpful. And then there's the minor use minor species page too. And to be clear, didn't go into what major and minor species are, but to be clear, fish are minor species, so they get access to some of the incentives that came out of the MOMS Act. And so I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate being invited to talk to you, and certainly please feel free to reach out. These are my kids. I went to DC Booth Fish Hatchery last summer, which was really fun. The kids are growing, becoming fishermen, and I'm relocated back to Chicago now because my husband got a job at the Shedd Aquarium. So we are here. So I thank you. I'm happy to answer your questions. Oh, and I almost forgot the beagles. Got 2 beagles.
There they are. Thanks very much, Stacey. That was a great overview of the process and FDA's role. Folks, feel free to drop your questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. And Andrea, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Cheers from Colombia. We work with mainly with tilapia and trout production here. And so this is very interesting because we are exporting products to your country. So we also need to have this in mind about the products that we can probably use here in Colombia, attending your requirements. However, I'm seeing that there is very limited list of products. And for example, if we have let's say issue with Streptococcus agalactiae, I didn't see that in the list of bacteria that can be subject of a specific product. So I was wondering if we only can use the product itself. Let's say you mentioned, I have here Aquaflor that is based on florfenicol, but in Colombia here we have the ICA, that is the institute that approves all the antibiotics and all the veterinarian products that we can use in animals. So florfenicol, for example, we have other product, but this contains florfenicol. Can we use this product in the animals that we are growing to export to the USA? I try to make myself a bit clear. I don't know.
So you're asking if you can use Aquaflor to treat strep A galactiae and tilapia there? So,
Or some other product that contains florfenicol, but that is not Aquaflor, exactly that brand. We have probably another brand here in Colombia approved by our institution.
So that's not really a question I don't think I can answer. You know, products coming into the US go through the seafood products that come in, go through go through CIFSAN, which is our Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, which is part of FDA, and they handle imported products. If they're being imported and have been treated, then there shouldn't be any residue of the product being treated.
Okay, yes, no, regarding the residue, we have that clear, and we have all the controls here in Colombia, and obviously there when the product arrives to the States.
Yeah, so I would, I can follow up with you separately. I can share with you what can and can't be done, imported, or you're welcome to email me or ask CVM, and we can get you all the information that you would need to use drugs in a country that's exporting to the US.
Yes, thank you. I will for sure write you.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Like I said, if I can't answer the question here, I'm happy to take it back and get you the answer. That's what we're here for.
Stacey, we have a question in the chat from Dave Groman. He's curious how the FDA handles herbal products, which may be applied to control topical infections.
Sorry, handles what products?
Herbal?
Oh, herbal
Plant-based,
products. Well, it depends on what it's being used for. It goes back to our definition of what a drug is. If the intended use of the drug is, or if the intended use of the product is to, I can't remember, is to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease in animals, or if it's going to affect the structure or function, then we would call it a drug and it would be regulated by FDA. It probably doesn't answer Dave's question. So it's about how the drug's being used. If it's being used for those things, then it would be a drug. We would regulate it.
Folks, we got time for another question or two, so feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute yourself. I've got a question while we're waiting here, Stacey. I'm curious about the future of drug development and where you see if funding wasn't a constraint, or the development wasn't a constraint, what might be the future for sort of new drugs? Like maybe genetic technologies or other things that you see coming down the road? Well,
I mean, there's so few drugs approved. I think that it's a pretty, it's an untapped market. There's a lot of areas where we could develop drugs. The industry needs new antimicrobials. The industry needs drugs in the US. They need drugs for sea lice. And so I think there's a lot of untapped or unmet needs in the US. There's also marine aquaculture where there's really no drugs approved specifically for use in marine aquaculture. So I think there's a lot of different areas. I don't know if there's any one particular answer to that.
I think Greg has a question here in the chat. It's an interesting one.
Yeah,
I don't know if you can see that.
I can see it. Thank you. Yeah, it looks like Greg's asking about live well treatments to ease stress, prevent disease. So if the product, again, it goes back to the definition of the drug. If the product is being used to ease stress, prevent disease, they're using that product as a drug, and it should be regulated by FDA. Yep, I agree that is done. I don't really have an answer for you. Yes.
So if there are situations like this that are either under the radar or being used inappropriately or marketed inappropriately, what's the process for reporting and the regulatory steps to intervene?
So I would encourage, again, an email to the Ask CDM at fda.hhs.gov. And then they would be able to respond to it. That whole arm of enforcement comes from our Office of Surveillance and Compliance. My role is in the pre-approval side of drug development. And so our Office of Surveillance and Compliance would respond to it. But I would encourage you to submit a question through them.
Sounds good. Looks like you got something to do, Greg. All right, thank you very much, Stacey. We appreciate the presentation today. Very well done.
Thank you.